She called it just a trip. A week in Destin, Florida. White sand beaches, emerald water, rental house right on the Gulf. She'd been planning it for months. Color-coded spreadsheets, group chats, restaurant reservations. I'm a logistics operations director. I manage supply chains for a mid-sized distribution company out of Macon, Georgia. I know how to read a plan. I know how to spot what's missing from one. And what was missing from Bridget's vacation plan was any version of reality where I was supposed to be okay with what she'd done. Because when I finally sat down and looked at the full guest list, the one she hadn't shown me until 10 days before departure, I saw two names that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. The first name was Kyle Draper. Kyle Draper was Bridget's high school boyfriend, the man she dated for 3 years before college, the man her mother, Sandra, still talked about at every single family gathering like he was the one who got away. The man who had texted Bridget on our wedding night. I'm not making that up. Our wedding night. She'd told me it was nothing, just an old friend congratulating her. I'd believed her, because I was the kind of man who trusted his wife. The second name was Devin Holloway. Devin Holloway was Bridget's first husband, and Devin Holloway had put me in the emergency room. Before I go any further, I need to tell you who I am. Because none of this makes sense without context. My name is Terrence. I'm 42 years old. I grew up in Warner Robins, Georgia, the kind of town where everyone knows your family, and expectations were simple. Work hard. Keep your word. Don't make trouble. My father drove a freight truck for 30 years. My mother taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school for 25. They gave me two things that have defined my entire adult life. A work ethic that borders on obsessive, and the belief that when you commit to someone, you commit fully. I met Bridget 8 years ago at a company holiday party in Atlanta. She was stunning. Dark hair, quick laugh, the kind of confidence that filled a room without trying. She was working in marketing at the time, and I was just getting promoted to regional operations lead. We hit it off immediately. She told me on our second date that she'd been married before, that it had ended badly, that she didn't like to talk about the details. I respected that. I didn't push. That was my first mistake. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged. We got married in a ceremony at a vineyard outside of Savannah that she planned down to the last ribbon on the centerpieces. And for the first 4 years of our marriage, things were good. Not perfect, but good. The problems started slowly. Sandra, my mother-in-law, never warmed to me the way I hoped. She was polite, but there was always something underneath the politeness. A distance. A measuring quality in her eyes, like she was constantly comparing me to some standard I didn't know about and finding me slightly short. Bridget's older sister, Patrice, was warmer, but she lived in Charlotte and we only saw her a few times a year. Bridget's friend group was tight and long established, and while they included me, I always felt like a tolerated guest rather than a member. But I pushed through those feelings, because that's what you do. You build, you stay patient, you trust that time and consistency will earn you a place. Then Devin came back into the picture. 18 months ago, Bridget told me that Devin had reached out. He was going through a rough time, she said. He'd lost his job. He was struggling. She wanted to help him. I told her I wasn't comfortable with that. She told me I was being insecure. That was a word she used with me a lot. Insecure, controlling, paranoid. Whenever I expressed discomfort about something, those were the words that came back. I told her what Devin had done. I want to be clear about this, because I want you to understand the full weight of what I'm about to describe. 3 years into our marriage, Devin showed up at our house. Bridget had apparently told him through mutual friends where we lived. I was home alone and he knocked on the door, and when I answered it, he shoved his way inside. He was drunk. He was angry. He said things I won't repeat here. And then he grabbed me by the collar, threw me against the wall, and hit me hard enough that I went down and hit the edge of the hallway table on the way. I had a laceration on my temple that required 8 stitches. I had bruised ribs. I spent 4 hours in the emergency room at Atrium Health in Macon. I pressed charges. He pled down to misdemeanor assault, got 18 months probation, and a fine. No jail time. Bridget cried through the entire court process and told me she felt terrible. I believed her. Because I loved her. Because I was the kind of man who believed the people he loved. And now, 18 months later, she was telling me he'd reached out. He was struggling, and she wanted to help him. I told her that if she wanted to help Devon Holloway, she could do it without my participation, without my knowledge, and preferably from a very significant distance. She called me cold. She said I needed to heal and move forward. I said I had moved forward. But moving forward didn't mean welcoming the man who put me in the hospital back into my life. She dropped the subject. Or I thought she had. Before we go any further, if this story is hitting you somewhere real, if you've ever been made to feel like your boundaries don't matter in your own home, your own marriage, your own life, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Hit like, drop a comment below, telling me if you've ever been in a situation where someone called your completely reasonable reaction controlling. Because I have a feeling I'm not alone. And this story is just getting started. The vacation was Bridget's idea. She'd been talking about a big family trip for 2 years. Her mom, her sister Patrice, Patrice's husband Glenn, their 2 kids, Bridget, me, maybe a couple of her closest friends. A week-long beach rental in Destin at one of those big houses right on the water, the kind with a private pool and enough bedrooms for everyone. She showed me photos of the house in February. I said it looked beautiful. She handled all the booking. I gave her my credit card information because that's how we manage shared expenses, and I trusted her. I want to say that again clearly. I trusted her. The first version of the guest list she shared with me in March had 12 people: Sandra, Patrice, and Glenn and their kids. Bridget's college friend Amber and her husband Dwayne. Bridget's work friend Cassidy. Me. It was a lot of people, and it wasn't exactly my version of a relaxing vacation, but I was willing. I wanted to make Bridget happy. I wanted to show Sandra that I was a good husband, a team player. Over the following weeks, the guest list kept shifting. Amber had a schedule conflict. Cassidy dropped in and out. Numbers changed. I stopped asking because Bridget assured me she had it handled. 10 days before departure, she sent me the final guest list in a text. Just a text. No conversation. No warning. I was at my desk reviewing freight reports when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't look at it right away. But I did. I scrolled through the names. Kyle Draper. Devon Holloway. I read them twice to make sure I wasn't misreading. I was not misreading. I called Bridget immediately. She answered on the second ring, and before I could even form a full sentence, she said, in a tone that was already slightly defensive, "Before you say anything, they were both going through hard times, and it seemed like a good opportunity for everyone to reconnect and relax." I want you to notice the language she used. Everyone to reconnect and relax. Not, "I wanted you to know that I invited them." Not, "I wanted to talk to you about this." Everyone to reconnect, as if this was a neutral collective situation, as if I had some existing relationship with Kyle Draper or Devon Holloway that might benefit from a beach vacation in Florida. I said, "Bridget, Devon Holloway put me in the hospital." She said, "That was years ago, Terrence. He's changed. He's been in therapy." I said, "And Kyle?" She said, "Kyle is just a friend. He's been going through a divorce. Mom thought it would be nice to include him." There it was. Mom thought it would be nice. Sandra. Of course. I said very calmly, because I am a man who was raised to keep his voice level when he's angry. "I'm not going on this vacation." Bridget's tone shifted. She said, "Terrence, you're being dramatic." I said, "I'm not going." She said, "You're going to ruin this for the whole family over nothing." I hung up. She called back 4 times. I let them go to voicemail. Then Sandra called. I answered that one. Sandra's voice had a particular quality when she wanted something from me that she wasn't going to ask for directly. Silky. Concerned sounding. Like she was deeply worried about me and not at all working an angle. She said, "Terrence, honey, I think there's been a misunderstanding." I said, "Sandra, I'm not going on a vacation with the man who assaulted me." She said, "Devon has grown so much. He's not that person anymore. And frankly, Terrence, carrying this kind of grudge isn't healthy for you or for your marriage." I said, "That's not a grudge, Sandra. That's a boundary." She paused. Then she said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. She said, "Well, if you're not going to come, we'll just give your ticket to Kyle. He'll appreciate it. He always did know how to be part of the group." She hung up. I sat in my home office in our house in Macon, Georgia, and I stared at my desk for probably 3 full minutes. She just offered my spot on a vacation I had paid for to my wife's high school boyfriend. Not figuratively. Literally. My plane ticket, my booking, my credit card. And then I did what I do when I need to think clearly. I opened a spreadsheet. Here is what I knew at that point. I had paid the rental deposit on the beach house, $14,000, charged to my personal card 2 months prior, because the rental required a substantial deposit, and Bridget had said she'd pay me back from the joint account once the transfer cleared. It had not cleared. I had checked. I had booked and paid for 6 round-trip flights on Delta out of Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson to Fort Walton Beach Airport, the closest airport to Destin. Those 6 tickets, which covered me, Bridget, Sandra, Patrice, Glenn, and their 2 kids, because Patrice's kids were under 2 and flew free, had cost a combined $3,100 on my card. The trip was 10 days away. I had a lawyer. His name is Preston Caldwell. Preston is a family law attorney in Macon, who I had quietly called 6 weeks earlier, when things between Bridget and me had started feeling like they were heading somewhere I didn't want to go. Just a consultation. Just to understand my options. Because I'm a logistics director. I plan for outcomes I hope don't happen. I called Preston from my office at 9:15 in the evening. He picked up. I told him what had happened. He said 3 things that I wrote down word for word. First, the rental deposit was paid from my personal card, not joint funds, which gave me standing to request a cancellation and dispute the charge depending on the rental company's policies. Second, all 6 flight tickets were also on my personal card, which meant I had the authority to cancel them. Third, he had already drafted the separation paperwork based on our prior conversations, and he could have it filed within 48 hours if I gave the word. I gave him the word on the flights and the rental. I did not give him the word on the separation paperwork. Not yet. I said, "Hold on that. But be ready." Then I made the calls. The rental company in Destin had a cancellation policy that allowed full refund minus a fee within 14 days of arrival. We were at exactly 11 days. There was a processing fee of $800. I authorized it without hesitation. The Delta tickets were refundable because I always, without exception, book refundable flights. I've worked in logistics my entire career. I know that plans change. I booked refundable. Every single one. I canceled all 6 and received full refunds to my card within 24 hours. Then I opened a new browser tab, went back to the Delta website, and booked 1 ticket. One way, not round trip. Atlanta to Denver, Colorado. My college roommate Brandon had been living in Denver for 15 years, working in commercial real estate, and he had told me approximately 6 times in the last year that I was welcome to visit anytime. I texted him. He replied in 4 minutes. His exact words, "Get on the plane, brother. Guest room is ready." I packed a bag. A real bag, not an overnight bag. A week's worth of clothes, my laptop, my charger, a book I'd been meaning to read for 3 months. Then I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, Bridget's phone started ringing at 7:15. I know this because she let out a sound I had never heard from her before. Something between a gasp and a strangled word. And then she said, "What did you do?" I was already up. I was in the kitchen making coffee. I said, "I canceled the rental and the flights." She came downstairs holding her phone with both hands, and her face had a quality I want to describe as accurately as possible. It was pale. Not angry pale. Pale like realization. Like the moment when you understand that the thing you thought wasn't a real threat actually was. She said, "You canceled everything?" I said, "All 6 flights, and the rental house." She said, "Terrence, that was $14,000 in deposit." I said, $800 cancellation fee, full refund on the rest. It processed overnight." She stared at me. I poured my coffee. She said, "You can't do this." I said, "I just did." Then her phone rang. It was Sandra. Bridget answered it, and I could hear Sandra's voice from across the kitchen, which tells you something about the volume Sandra was operating at. I couldn't make out every word, but the general emotional content was clear. Then Bridget put her on speaker. I don't know if she intended to do that as a strategy, or if she was too overwhelmed to think clearly. Either way, Sandra's voice filled the room. Sandra said, "Terrence, you need to explain yourself right now. You had no right to cancel those tickets. Those were family plans. People took time off work." I said, "I paid for those tickets, Sandra. Every one of them." Sandra said, "That's not the point. The point is that this family made plans and you've—" I said, "This family made plans that included a man who physically assaulted me, and I said I wasn't coming. And then you offered my seat to Kyle Draper, which told me everything I needed to know about how my presence on this trip was viewed." A pause. Sandra said, "That was just a joke, Terrence." I said, "It wasn't funny." Another pause. When Sandra spoke again, her voice had changed. Gone was the silky concern. What replaced it was something colder. She said, "Bridget needs people around her who support her, who make her feel like a priority. You've never understood how to do that." I said, "I've been Bridget's priority for 8 years, Sandra. My credit card has been funding this family's life for 8 years. And what I've learned in the last 12 hours is exactly how much that's been appreciated." I ended the call. Not Bridget's phone. I took my own phone out of my pocket and I dialed Preston's number. Right there in the kitchen, with Bridget standing 5 feet away. Preston answered. I said, "Preston, go ahead and file." The next 72 hours were some of the most exhausting of my life, and I spent 4 years in supply chain management during a global shipping crisis, so that's saying something. Bridget went from shock to anger, to something that felt like genuine grief in the space of about 6 hours. She called Patrice, who called me to ask if we could talk. I respect Patrice, so I said yes. Patrice said, "Terrence, I want you to know that I had no idea Devin was going to be on this trip until last week. I was as surprised as you. And I want you to know that what he did to you was wrong, and I've never forgotten that." I said, "Patrice, I appreciate that. I really do." She said, "Can I ask you something honestly?" I said yes. She said, "Is this the end for you and Bridget?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "I hope it's not. But I understand if it is." That was the most honest and human thing anyone in that family had said to me in years, and I almost had to excuse myself to collect my emotions. Bridget's friends split into 2 camps. Amber, who had always been genuinely warm to me, texted to say she was sorry and that she thought what Sandra and Bridget had done was wrong. Cassidy posted a vague Instagram story about people who blow up relationships over nothing, that anyone who knew us would understand immediately. I screenshotted it, not for any particular legal reason, just because I am a logistics director, and I document things by instinct. Sandra stopped calling me. Instead, she sent a long text that contained several notable phrases. 1. I have always welcomed you into this family, despite your difficulty connecting with people. 2. Kyle is a good man who has always supported Bridget emotionally in ways that have clearly been missing. 3. If you file for divorce, you need to understand that Bridget gave up opportunities to be with people who would have truly cherished her. I read that text once. I forwarded it to Preston. Then I deleted it. Here is what I want you to understand about that text. Sandra had just confirmed in writing that she viewed Kyle Draper as an emotional alternative to me, that she had been building a case against my marriage, that she had used a family vacation as a vector for doing it. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not me overreacting. This was a coordinated effort that my wife had either participated in or allowed to happen. I flew to Denver on a Tuesday morning. Brandon picked me up from Denver International in his truck, and within 10 minutes of driving through the city, watching the mountains in the distance through the windshield, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even fully noticed was tight. Brandon and I had roomed together at Georgia Tech. He knew me before I was a logistics director, before I was a husband, before I was any of the versions of myself I'd built over 20 years. He knew me when I was a 20-year-old from Warner Robins with big plans and no real idea how to execute them. He asked me one question on the drive from the airport. He said, "How are you actually doing?" I said. "I've been better, but I'm clearer than I've been in a long time." He nodded. Then this was the right call. We spent 4 days doing nothing that required any emotional labor. Hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park, which I had never done, and which turned out to be genuinely transformative in the way that nature is when you've been sitting inside your own head too long. Eating at a Brazilian steakhouse in downtown Denver that Brandon swore was the best meal he'd had in a decade. Watching playoff basketball. Sleeping 8 hours a night like a person who had solved something. On the third night, Bridget called. I answered. Her voice was different, quieter. The anger was gone. What was left sounded almost fragile. She said, "I should have talked to you before I added them to the list." I said, "Yes." She said, "I know what Devin did. I've never pretended that was okay. I thought enough time had passed." I said, "Bridget, 8 stitches don't have a time limit. You don't get to decide when I'm over something like that." A long pause. She said, "I know." I said, "Did you know Kyle was going to be offered my seat if I didn't come?" Another pause, longer than the first. She said, "That was my mom. I didn't know she was going to say that." I said, "But you didn't tell her not to, when she did." No answer. I said, "That tells me something, Bridget." She started crying, not the loud, dramatic kind, the quiet kind, which was actually harder to hear. She said, "I don't want to lose you." I said, "Then you should have thought about that before you put 2 people on a vacation who had no business being near our marriage." I told her I needed more time, and I hung up. Preston called the next morning with an update on the filing. The separation paperwork had been received and logged. Georgia law required a 30-day separation period before a divorce could proceed. We were beginning that clock. He advised me not to move back into the marital home during that period without careful consideration, as it could affect the legal status. I was already in Denver, so that part was handled. He also told me something that I hadn't thought through fully. He said, "Terrence, given that you funded the vast majority of shared expenses from your personal accounts and the joint account appears to have been drawing primarily from your income, you have a reasonably strong financial position in a settlement discussion." I said, "I'm not trying to take anything from her." He said, "I know. I'm telling you what your position is so you understand it going in." That conversation reminded me of something my father used to say. He drove freight trucks for 30 years, and he told me once that the most important thing about a long route was knowing exactly where you were at all times. Not where you wanted to be. Not where you assumed you were. Where you actually were. That knowledge was the only thing that kept you from ending up somewhere you never intended to go. I had spent 8 years in a marriage not knowing exactly where I was. Assuming good faith. Assuming that love was enough to smooth over the places where my instincts were telling me something wasn't right. Assuming that the man who put me in the hospital would eventually stop mattering if I just kept being patient and steady and good. I had been patient. I had been steady. I had been good. And what it had bought me was a vacation guest list that included my attacker and my wife's high school boyfriend, and a mother-in-law who offered away my plane seat like it was a spare invitation to a dinner party. I came home from Denver after 7 days. Not to the marital home. To a short-term furnished apartment in downtown Macon that Preston had helped me identify. It was on the 4th floor of a building near the Ocmulgee River, and the view from the window was simple and clean, and for the first time in years I felt like I was living inside my own life instead of orbiting around someone else's. I'm going to tell you what happened next, and I want you to understand that I'm telling it plainly, without bitterness, because bitterness is a weight I'm choosing not to carry. Bridget called me 8 times in the first week I was back in Macon. I answered 3 of those calls. The conversations were difficult and honest in the way that conversations can be when the pretending is finally over. She told me things she'd never said during the marriage, things about feeling pressure from her mother, about having spent years managing Sandra's expectations, and never fully admitting to herself that those expectations had started shaping her own choices. She told me she had started seeing a therapist. I told her that was good, and that I meant it sincerely. I did not tell her that therapy would change what had happened, because it wouldn't change what had happened. It would only change what came next. And what came next was no longer something I could determine for both of us. Sandra called me once. Just once. Her voice was different from any version of it I'd heard before. Smaller. She said, "I owe you an apology, Terrence." I said, "Thank you, Sandra." I said it simply, without warmth or coldness, because it was the honest response. She had done something that couldn't be undone with a phone call. But she had called. That was something. Kyle Draper, as far as I know, did not go to Destin. The trip didn't happen. No house, no flights, no beach week. $14,000 worth of planning dissolved in a single evening because I opened a spreadsheet and made some phone calls. I don't know what Devon Holloway's life looks like today, and I don't need to. I hope he stays far away from mine. Patrice sent me a card in the mail about 3 weeks after everything happened. Handwritten. She said, "I have always thought you were one of the good ones, Terrence. I hope whatever comes next treats you well." I put that card on the windowsill of my apartment in the downtown Macon building with a view of the river, and it's still there. Here is what I know now. 8 weeks out from the night I canceled 6 airline tickets and a beach house rental and called my lawyer from my kitchen while my wife stood 5 feet away. I know that protecting yourself is not the same as being cold. I am not a cold man. I am a man who grew up being told that commitment meant absorbing whatever came at you and staying steady. I believed that for a long time. I don't believe it anymore. Commitment means something, but it doesn't mean that your pain is always negotiable and your boundaries are always optional. Somewhere along the way, those two things got twisted in my life, and the twisting happened so slowly that I almost didn't notice it until I was staring at a guest list that included the man who gave me 8 stitches. I know that the people in your life will show you, eventually, exactly what they think you're worth. Not in the big moments, in the small ones, in the casual, throwaway moments when they think you're not paying close enough attention. Sandra's voice on the phone saying, "We'll just give your ticket to Kyle." That was the moment. 8 years of marriage, and that was the moment where I understood, fully and without any room for doubt, what my presence in that family actually meant to her. I know that a spreadsheet and a phone call can change the entire trajectory of your life. I'm a logistics director. I believe in systems. I believe in documentation. I believe in understanding the terms and conditions before you sign anything. I had signed 8 years of my life and substantial personal funds into a marriage, and in the end what saved me from losing more of both was the fact that I'd booked refundable flights and kept detailed records. This is not romantic advice, but it is true. I know that Patrice was right when she said I might be one of the good ones. Not because I'm perfect. I'm not. I've made mistakes in my marriage, real ones. Things I've thought about honestly during long nights in the apartment by the river. I wasn't always emotionally present. There were years when work consumed me in ways that left Bridget carrying things she shouldn't have had to carry alone. Those were real failures, and I own them. But none of that was what happened on the night I saw that guest list. None of my failures justified what was on it. And the man who assaulted me was never going to become someone I was expected to share a beach house with. Not in this life. Not with 8 stitches still somewhere in my memory. Not with Bridget's voice saying, "He's changed," like that was supposed to be enough. It wasn't enough. Some things don't get to become just a trip. If you're watching this and you recognize something in what I've been describing, the slow erosion, the word controlling used against you when you try to hold a line, the sense that the people around you have decided your discomfort is a problem to be managed around rather than taken seriously, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to have limits. You are allowed to enforce them. You are allowed to cancel the vacation, book the one-way flight, call the lawyer from your kitchen while your wife watches. You are allowed to know your worth and act like it. This is not the ending I planned for my marriage. It may not be the ending at all. Bridget and I are still in the 30-day window. I don't know what the next chapter looks like, but I know what the last chapter looked like. And I know that the night I opened that spreadsheet and started making calls was the first night in years I felt like I was actually directing my own life. My name is Terrence. I'm 42 years old. I'm a logistics operations director from Macon, Georgia, and I refuse to go on the vacation. And it was the best decision I've made in years.